Howdy folks, hope you're all having a good weekend. Welcome to the Holy Land. Today we're in Israel and we're approaching the northern shore of the Dead Sea. Now, full disclosure, I do actually have a confession to make here. This series is supposed to be about me talking about places that I have visited during my service in the Royal Navy. And I have never actually been to the Dead Sea. But that's not the Royal Navy's fault. They did give me the opportunity, but I was young and stupid, and I didn't take it. I can't remember exactly when it was I was in Israel. It must have been one of my Mediterranean deployments, obviously, so I'm pegging it late 90s. So I would have been in my late 20s. And at the time I was given the choice of staying where I was, because obviously the ship didn't visit the Dead Sea, it's landlocked. We were calling in Haifa in northern Israel. More on that later. Haifa I did actually visit. But we were given the choice of staying where we were and just going ashore and enjoying the sights and sounds of Haifa, or climbing into a rickety old bus, driving through the searing heat of the Jordan Valley for 3 hours, and splashing around in a body of water 1,400 feet below sea level and nearly 10 times as salty as the ocean for a couple of hours. Well, naturally I should have said yes, because everybody who did go on the trip to the Dead Sea said it was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. But, well, like I said, young and stupid, so I stayed in Haifa. Not that there's anything wrong with Haifa, but it's a city like any other, and the Dead Sea is a once-in-a-lifetime experience. And I passed on it, because I was an idiot. It's not the only opportunity I passed up on when we were in Israel. But before I get on to that, although we are heading in its direction right now, I should probably explain exactly what it is that goes on whenever a Royal Navy warship visits a foreign port where they're going to grant leave to the ship's company. Because people don't just go ashore and head to the nearest tourist agency and say, "Hit me up with one of those Dead Sea tours, my good man." I mean, you can do that, but things get organised for you. What happens is, in advance of the visit, somebody on board is designated as the visit liaison officer. It's usually a junior officer, but not always. Sometimes it's one of the senior chief petty officers. Now, I'm not talking about logistics here, fuel, food, naval stores, things like that. That's all handled by the Marine Engineering Department in the case of fuel, and the Logistics Department in the case of everything else. Now, I'm talking here about activities for the ship's company when they go ashore. That is obviously going to be highly dependent on what's actually available for you to do wherever it is that you're visiting. For example, on the way back from the Gulf one time, we stopped at the NATO refueling jetty at Djibouti in Ethiopia for 1 day. No leave was granted. Nobody was allowed to go ashore because it was too dangerous to go ashore. And even if we had been allowed to go ashore, there was absolutely nothing to do. Well, that's not strictly true. There was one makeshift bar, just a couple of 100 metres from the jetty, but if we'd spent any money in there, we would have seriously destabilised the local economy. I mean, that place was such a shithole that one of the things that you do, even if you're only alongside for 1 day, is you get rid of all the rubbish on board, because we don't just ditch it over the side at sea. The Royal Navy is actually fairly ecologically conscious where this sort of thing is concerned. And the second the gangway went down, they made the broadcast, "Out all gash, which basically means everyone who's not on watch or attending to harbour stations, getting the actual business of the ship tied up alongside the jetty, the second that gangway is down, you grab any bin bags and you take them ashore and dump them in the skips." We barely managed to get halfway down the jetty before people were getting mobbed. The rubbish bags were getting taken off them, and the mob was ripping them open to find things of value in the stuff we were throwing away. I saw one guy very, very happy because he found one flip-flop. I mean, I'm laughing about it, but the poverty was it was terrible. So it's not really surprising that no visit liaison officer was nominated for the day that we spent refueling and attempting to get rid of our rubbish in Djibouti. There was a visit liaison officer nominated for Haifa, however, not just because Haifa is a great place to visit, but because of all of the places like the Dead Sea that you can visit within a couple of hours' drive from Haifa. And I can't remember who he was, but he did an excellent job. And one of the other visits that he organised for the ship's company was to this place. You've probably heard of it. It's called Jerusalem. And this was another visit that I failed to take advantage of. That right down there, that's the Temple Mount, the location of some of the oldest churches and mosques in the world. A lot of people think of Jerusalem as being something straight out of the life of Brian, but that's only really true of the old city, which is right there on the Temple Mount. The rest of Jerusalem is as modern and bustling a city as anywhere else. We'll be coming back to Jerusalem later, but now let's actually go to some place that I did visit and never left when I was in Israel, the port city of Haifa. Haifa is Israel's third biggest city, right after Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. But steady on there, just because it's Israel's third biggest city does not mean it's a big city. It really isn't. It has a population of just over 250,000, which means it is pretty big by Israeli standards, because Israel itself only has a population of just less than 10 million. It's this small population, and the fact that they are surrounded by not very friendly neighbours, which is the reason why everybody in Israel who can has military training. And that's something that became apparent very, very quickly when we stepped off the ship and went ashore in Haifa. You ever seen pictures of Israeli mothers, young Israeli mothers, standing outside school gates waiting to pick up their children, with Uzis slung over their shoulders? Yeah, that's real. That was a bit of a culture shock for me. I'm not saying everybody was tooled up with submachine guns in Haifa, but a lot of them were. And not all of them were in uniform either. Immediate culture shock aside, however, Haifa was a great city. Even though it was a bit of a bitch to get around. Because it's basically, it's not that big. You don't have to go particularly far to get anywhere in Haifa, but you do tend to have to go up a lot, because the entire city is built on the slopes of Mount Carmel. We're passing over the dockyard now where we were berthed. And honestly, most of the time when you're in Haifa, you don't even need to leave the dockyard, because Haifa is a very, very popular port of call for the US 6th Fleet. I can't remember the name of the ship, or ships that were there when we were there, but there was a big-assed helicopter carrier right on the other side of the jetty from us, 40 yards away from our piddly little destroyer. Thousands of American sailors. And those guys spend a lot of time at sea. In the Royal Navy, it's unusual for you to spend more than 2 weeks at sea between ports of call. But in the US Navy, it's not unusual to spend 40 days at sea between ports of call. So when they get ashore, they know how to party. And they did a great job of looking after themselves and their guests as well, because there was a massive, completely free, paid for by the US Navy barbecue on the jetty between our two ships every single night. And they had enough musicians on board that ship, amateur musicians obviously, that they were able to put on a Battle of the Bands competition every night between the various different bands belonging to their ship's company. And of course, they weren't just going to sit there having a massive barbecue in a Battle of the Bands every night, 30 metres from the end of our gangway. We were all invited, because that's just what the US Navy's like. They are incredibly generous. So they provided the steaks, burgers and the music, and because beer is one thing that Royal Navy warships are not short of, we provided the beer, and it was party time on the jetty every night. Of course, things were even better when you got ashore. Because the US 6th Fleet spends so much time in Haifa, they're not headquartered in Haifa. The headquarters of the US 6th Fleet is in Naples in Italy. But Haifa is an important resupply and recreation base for them. And so there's a USO club in Haifa, which is normally restricted only to US servicemen. But, well, the Americans are very generous people. So we were allowed to use the USO club facilities as well. Unfortunately, on this occasion, their generosity came back to bite them in the arse. And it was all because of one of our radio operators, who went by the name of Mick Baxendale. Now, Mick was a good friend, and he is easily one of the funniest people I have ever had the privilege of knowing. The problem was that there was no line that Mick would not cross in order to get a laugh. And it's one of the things that made him as funny as he was. But he definitely stepped over the line and badly misjudged his audience on that night at the USO Club in Haifa. Remember, this club is packed with US Navy sailors who've been at sea for at least 40 days, and this is the first occasion they've had in all of that time to have a drink. So they're all very drunk. And Mick decided this was the perfect opportunity to tell the following joke. So Mick has an audience of US Navy 6th Fleet sailors gathered around him, and everybody's very, very drunk. And Mick decides to challenge them with this. Name one American state that starts with PH. Instantly, somebody shouts out Philadelphia. Nonsense, says Mick. Philadelphia is a city in the state of Pennsylvania. Try again. So the assembled American sailors all put their heads together, and then eventually come out with, there is no state that starts with PH. To which Mick replied, yes there is, Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor isn't a state, they all said. It was in 1941, says Mick. Completely misjudging his audience. Well, I'll cut a long story short. In the riot that followed, Mick was invited to leave the USO Club via the window. The following day, after he'd had his wounds stitched up, the executive officer on board was most displeased to find that Mick had been presented with a bill to pay for the repairs to the window that had been thrown out of the night before, along with a note to say that British sailors were no longer welcome at the Haifa USO Club. Thanks, Mick. It was kind of funny, though. The one other thing that I do remember about Haifa, aside from the nightly barbecues and battle of the bands on the jetty, and the battle of the USO Club, was something that I had never seen before anywhere else, anywhere that I'd visited in my career in the Navy thus far. I mean, I'd been to all kinds of places. Well, actually, come to think of it, at this stage of my career, I can't have been in the Navy more than 3 or 4 years, because I knew Mick Baxendale, and he was a radio operator, which means I was also a radio operator at the time. And I branch transferred to the writer branch in 1995, so this must have been in my early 20s, not my late 20s. So I was even younger and more stupid than I may have previously led you to believe. But I'm trying to put a date on this because it's actually fairly significant. Because in Haifa, for the first time ever, I found a Subway. The entire concept of walking into a restaurant where all they served was sandwiches was utterly alien to me, but I loved it. I have to admit, the reason I walked into the Subway in the first place was because sitting at the sandwich bar counter on the street were a pair of very, very attractive young Israeli women, both with Uzis slung over their shoulders, of course. But the idea that I could just have any sandwich that I wanted was great, and I thought this will never catch on back in the UK. Of course, 4 months later, when the ship got back from its Mediterranean deployment, there were Subways everywhere. But the very first time I actually had a Subway, and I kept going back because it was so good, obviously things have slipped a little in the intervening years, but yeah, the very first time I had a Subway, in fact the first time I realised that such a thing was even possible, was in Haifa in Israel. It was a great little city, and I thoroughly enjoyed my time there. I just wish I'd taken more advantage of all the visits to the various different attractions like the Dead Sea and the Old City in Jerusalem that the visit liaison officer had gone to the trouble of organising, but yeah, what can I say? Young and stupid. Actually, while we're on the subject of American generosity, and I don't know if this has changed, I suspect it probably hasn't, but back in my day this was absolutely true. There's a thing in the Royal Navy, it's called getting grippoed. Don't ask me where the expression comes from, I have no idea. It's just the phrase that we use. Right? A grippo is when you're in a foreign port and members of the local population just turn up offering to take you home and feed you. Right? That's a grippo. If you are lucky enough to be serving in a NATO navy and you get a visit to an American port, you always have the option, of course, of just going ashore and spending your own money. But you will not need to, because the ship will be flooded with so many offers of hospitality from the locals that there won't be enough sailors on board to satisfy the demand. I'm not joking. Ships would have to put up pin boards, they'd call them grippo boards, with all of the offers pinned to the board. And you would just go to the grippo board, once leave had been granted, pick one of the offers, check the time, and at that time, with the note in your hand, be at the end of the gangway, and they would turn up, take you home, feed you, ply you with drink all night, entertain you, and then, when you were completely legless and incapable of going anywhere under your own steam, they would drive you back to the ship and deliver you to the quartermaster. And this happens every time you're in America. Or it did. I don't know if it still does, but I suspect things probably haven't changed. Well, anyway, that's it for today's video. I thought I'd end by showing you just how hilariously incompetent the AI autopilot, which was introduced in the latest update, actually is. I just want to make it clear, this is not me attempting a landing here. I realise I have a completely unjustified reputation for being utterly incompetent when it comes to putting aircraft down on the ground. But this is not me. This is Microsoft Flight Sim's AI autopilot trying and failing to put a Cessna 172 down on Jerusalem International Airport. It's probably going to try to use the excuse that this airport is permanently closed, and if you want to fly to Jerusalem, you have to go to Ben Gurion Airport, which is 35 miles away. But I'm not buying it. Yep, that's right. Jingles landing. No extra charge. You're welcome. Take care, folks. I'll catch you next time.